The Aurelia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope you all had a safe and happy summer. And we're thrilled to welcome you back now to the September installment of the History Speaker Series. Before we get started, I want to thank some very special individuals for making these events possible. The first one is Phil Jackman, who did our logo design and who designs all the amazing posters for us. I want to thank Deanne McCallum, who is our partner at Rogers. Tonight, we are very grateful to have Lori Oschefski joining us and speaking on a topic that, as I said to her before we started, was so much more prevalent than I had ever realized, especially here in Aurelia. Lori is the president of Home Children Canada, which she founded in 2012. Home Children Canada is now the leading organization in the world that advocates for the lost voices of so many children brought to our shores. Home Children Canada provides families with a platform to tell their stories and find free help with their own family research. Lori's personal connection comes through her mother, who arrived in Canada in 1924 at the age of 2. Lori is also the author of Bleeding of the Lambs, Canada's British Home Children. Without further ado, please welcome Lori Oschefski.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come out and speak. We do have a huge connection to the city of Aurelia, as we know that my mother, who came to Canada at the age of 2, she was born in Fair Valley, but when she was probably, about the age of 9 or 10, the family ended up moving into Aurelia, and she grew up on Gill Street in Aurelia. We were just discussing that over 4 million Canadians are descendants of the British Home Children, yet most of our population don't know about the children and what they endured and why they came to Canada. So it's really important that we share this story and that we make Canadians aware of the children and the impact that they had on our society and in the building of our nation. So with the Home Children, in 1869, a mass wave of structured immigration of children from the United Kingdom to Canada was started. Now, the UK had been immigrating their children for almost 300 years prior to the start of this structured wave of immigration of the children. So it was a little bit different. Like I said, it was more structured. There was more paperwork done. And for most of the children, there was records that were kept of the children that came over. Throughout the years that this program ran, which is 1869 to about 1949, there were over 100,000 children that were sent, and brought to our Canadian shores. The children were, for the most part, forever separated from their families, from their friends, their culture. They were here to work as laborers and domestics. They were collectively known as the British Home Children. I like to, I think of them as forced orphanization for profit, and we will get into why I believe that's the proper term to refer to them as we go through the presentation. Over 50 sending organizations were involved in the immigration of these children to Canada. The best known was the Dr. Bernardo of Homes, and Dr. Bernardo was responsible for placing a lot of children in this area in central Ontario. We had a big receiving home. As you can see, there's a Hazelbury receiving home, a picture of the building there. And it was located in Peterborough, Ontario. And through that home was filtered over 9,000 children. And that was the girls receiving home. In the earlier years, there were a few boys, but by 1886, it was mostly girls. It was all girls that came through that home. The immigration of children continued officially in Ontario here until 1939. After the Second World War, Fairbridge Farms brought about 300 children out to Vancouver, BC. And so that's why we get the immigration up to 1949. But the vast majority of the immigration came to an end in 1939. And it was an interesting reason why it kind of came to an end. Children were from toddlers up to the age of 18. As we've already heard, my mother was 2 when she was brought here to Canada. And I think in this area, we would probably better know them, know the Bernardo homes. But there was Quarriers and Fagans and the Church of England, Waifs and Strays, Annie McPherson's and Maria Rye. Now, these children were sent from one end of Canada to the other. Children were mostly sent in parties, often hundreds at a time. Each were provided with a trunk or a duffel bag. And this is really important for us to take a look at, because we're now starting to recover some of these trunks. And, really, when you think of the amount of children that came across, we really don't have that many trunks that have survived. But it was an interesting thing that happened through COVID, because everybody was out there cleaning their farms and cleaning their attics. And we collected probably at least 20 trunks of all variety of sizes and, the various sending organizations that were sending children to Canada. So I was quite actually pleased with that, because I had some of them that were really on my most wanted list. And I have them. They're here sitting in my living room with me. So it was really great to get those. This mass movement of children was legal. As of 1891, the Custody of Children's Act in the UK made it legal to immigrate children out of the country without any further notice to the parents. So it was an interesting law that they put into place. It was interesting reasons why they put it into place. But it is effectively mandated that, if you relinquish your child to the care of the Bernardos or Fagans or whatever sending organization it was, you relinquished your right, your parental custody rights of that child. And therefore, these organizations could make the decision to immigrate your child, and they didn't have to tell you. When we talk about the home children, a lot of people think that we're talking about the guest children, and the guest children were the children that came over to help protect them against the Second World War. So the guest children arrived starting in June of 1940. As we've heard, the immigration of the home children ended in 1939. The primary difference between the guest children and the home children was the guest children were supposed to go home. They were supposed to be reunited with their parents. They weren't to be kept here in Canada, and they were certainly not supposed to be put to work on the farms. Now, whether they did or didn't, that's, of course, different stories and individual stories that come out of it, the same thing as the home children. And again, the home children were never to be sent back home again. They were discouraged from communicating with their parents, and not like we had over 100,000 children, so there was over 100,000 different stories. So, some of the children did manage to keep in contact with their parents, while others were completely cut off from parents and siblings. And, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason why one child could and maybe another couldn't. We've never really quite figured that one out. We still do a lot of research and reading and trying to figure out why that was the way it was. There was over 100,000 home children. There was 1,500 guest children. The guest children stopped coming to Canada in August of 1940. So they really didn't come over, for a very great length of period of time. And that was because one of the ships that was carrying the home children, the city of Benares, was torpedoed and it sank. And I believe there was 90 children on board that ship at the time. And of the 90, I think there was over 70 that perished. And then they decided that the waters were too rough for the children, so they wouldn't be sending them. Interestingly enough, during the First World War, they did pause the immigration of children for a number of years while the war was on. And that was paused for the very same reason, because the dangerous waters and the dangers of the ships being sunk and the children being harmed. Now, when we look at the home children, it began in Victorian England, and I believe it began as a mission of rescue. I mean, that's undoubtedly, what was in their hearts when they started with these programs. I mean, we had overcrowding situations in the cities brought on from the Industrial Revolution and all the people moving into the cities such as, London, England, and overcrowding, unsanitary living conditions, and, just terrible poverty in those years. And something needed to be done to help the children. So these philanthropists set up institutions, or big homes where they would welcome the children to help get them off the streets, to help provide a little bit better of a living condition for them. And I think it was quite a good thing that they started. But I think without, structures and laws and, people who oversee these things, that sometimes these things kind of go down the wrong road. The issue here in Canada was we did not want the poor children. We believed that they were diseased and genetic defects, that they were going to taint our good Canadian stock with their diseases and their degeneracies. And we had people like Frederick Nichols, who was the head of the Canadian Manufacturers Association, and he was the editor of the Canadian Manufacturers Association magazine. He was also a member of Parliament as well in Canada. And in one lengthy article, he wrote, "These wastes and strays are tainted and corrupt with moral slime and filth, inherited from parents and surroundings of the most foul and disgusting character, and all the washing and clean clothes that Dr. Bernardo may bestow cannot possibly fit them so that they will become desirable citizens of our country." That basically reflected the general overall thought of our medical community and our House of Commons when it came to the kids. There was no compassion shown whatsoever for children that had come from obviously very traumatic backgrounds, who were suffering, all types of trauma brought on from what they had suffered. I mean, if they came into care in the first place, there was trauma in their childhood, and then to be, taken from their surroundings and put on these boats and then dive bombed on Canadian farms all over the place. I mean, there wasn't recognition that these children were suffering, and perhaps maybe that's the way, why they appeared to be just not well. One of the worst cases that we had, it happened in about 1895. It was George Green, was a boy that came into Canada through the Dr. Bernardo homes. And he was horribly, horribly abused and neglected. He was murdered actually by Helen Finley, the woman that was, that he was assigned to work on her farm. And when the authorities found him, his body was laid on a bed of straw with a hole cut out for his toilet. George Green was a Bernardo boy who had grown up in squalid surroundings in the city of London, so he had already suffered. He'd been beaten by his drunken mother and then left to fend for himself, and for a short while there was a ray of hope, a chance for a new life full of promise. And that would have been, if essentially when the Bernardos took him in and cared for him in their, institutions in the UK. A chance for a new life full of promise. And then in the backwoods of Grey County, Ontario, George found a rural hell and died. One night, Helen dragged him from his bedroom and threw him into the stable with the hogs. For 2 nights, he lay wide-eyed in terror, waiting for the dreaded footsteps, waiting for, for her to come after him, basically, again. His diet was mash, bran porridge, and an occasional slice of bread, which he often had to eat standing up. We could go on with, it's written there. He was a broken child. He was too weak to drag himself into another day of taunts, threats, beating, and torture. Physically, emotionally, and spiritually, he was drained. And one cold November morning, his body finally joined his spirit in death. And you would think that, this was all over the newspapers at the time, and you think that there would have been a whole lot of sympathy shown for this child, and there never was. In 1897, there was a law that was put into place. And that law was to, you would have thought that there would have been that, well, the law came about because of George Green, and you would have thought that that law would have been here to help protect the children. But it was not. It was here put into place to protect us against the children who are intellectually or physically defective, like George Green. These children did not need to come to Canada to be saved. They were saved when they were brought into the institutions where they were clothed, where they were fed, and where they had a ray of hope. Sending these children to Canada did not save them. It did for some children, but we can't say what would have happened to those children had they been left in England. I think it changed the odds for the children. I mean, some children who came to Canada survived because they came to Canada. And some children, like George Green, died because he came to Canada. We did end up finding his grave, finding where he was buried. And a few years ago, we did put a memorial stone in the cemetery for him. The woman that murdered him, she spent a year in jail, and then she married and moved into the United States. I don't think she ever had any children of her own or anything like that, which, thank heavens for that. There were tens of thousands of children brought into Canada who were placed at a great risk. Every last single child that came here to Canada was open to this kind of abuse and neglect. And they say that 2/3 of the children suffered abuse and neglect. And they said that if you were to look at the abuses and the neglect that they suffered in today, from through today's eyes, that number would be considerably higher. There were no safeguards put into place whatsoever to ensure that these children received a good home or they received a bad home. So if the child got a good home, they were lucky. And if they got a bad home, they were unlucky. Most parents were not told when their child was removed from the United Kingdom. Again, this is an after sailing notice. They did, in the case of Winifred Payne, they did notify her siblings. Winifred Payne was one of the children that was actually a true orphan, and most of the children were not. Only 12% of the children that came here to Canada were true orphans, and Winifred Payne was one of them. This after sailing notice, we do have the original in our collections, which is a very interesting document to have. It said that, that she, and this was done in 1905, she said that she had left for Canada sometime this month. It didn't say where she was going. It didn't say how they could contact her. It didn't say that, if your family situation had improved, that you could come and retrieve your child from, the sending organization. It basically just said that she's gone. In some of the contracts that they had to sign to send the kids, when they were bringing the kids into the institution, it contained a Canada clause, and a Canada clause basically said that they were signing their parental rights away from those children. A lot of parents did relinquish the children to the care of Bernardo's or the various sending organizations. I mean, they had no social systems in place in the UK through those years. I mean, in today's society, we have like our mother's allowance and our welfare and food banks and different things like that, where you can turn to in times of need to help, feed your family and help, keep your family together. But they didn't have those systems in place in the UK. So you either had to put your child into a workhouse or you put your child into one of these voluntary care organizations. And certainly the living conditions were much better for children in these organizations. But again, they didn't tell you that you lost your parental rights. So many parents, when things got better, would go back to retrieve their children only to find out that they were gone. There's this myth that these children were here to become parts of loving families. And that is not true. But these children were here to work, all of them. They were a source of cheap labor on our farms and in our households. Now, if they became a member of a loving family like my mother, then they were very fortunate. But that's not the reasons why they came here to Canada. And Dr. Bernardo himself in 1900 writes this in an article that he wrote for his newsletter magazine called Ups and Downs. He says, "We're not so young and unsophisticated as to imagine that the farmers take our boys for love. The primary object of the farmers in taking a boy is that his services be useful to him. In the UK, Canada was marketed as a haven for children, and there was all kinds of propaganda that was sold in England that showed beautiful homes and showed, we're one of the loving family. And, it painted a picture of life in Canada like it was all roses and sunshine, and parents really believed that they would be giving their child a better chance and a fighting chance in this life by sending them here to Canada. The reality is that, they lived in, typical farming homes and farming families, which is nothing wrong with these buildings at any stretch of the imagination, but they're not mansions like they showed people. And you take a look at the barns in the background. Well, a lot of the children were allowed to mingle with the farmer and their family and their children because of all the things that our medical community and our House of Commons said about the children, that they were tainted and corrupt. And, we had Dr. C.K. Clark, who was the head of Canadian psychology in Canada. He was the dean of psychology at the Queen's University in Kingston. And, and he wrote that they all had syphilis. In one lecture, he said, in Canada, we are deliberately adding to our population hundreds of children bearing all the stigmata of physical and mental degeneracies. The next generation must be considered, but the harvest has already commenced. An insane person here, a criminal there. As I said, they were brought here to become indentured servants. And this is where we get the forced orphans for profit, because there was contracts that were made up for these children. Here's a contract for Cecil Bennett, and he had to work from September 1907 to April 1913, $120 minus expenses. So if he had to have clothing, haircuts, or anything like that, that could be deducted off his pay. Bernardo's took a forced donation of $1 a year from each of the children that were placed out. Cecil Bennett, these contracts bound the children by law. Okay, so by law, they were bound until they were 18 years of age, but they weren't to receive this money until they were 21. Now, Cecil Bennett, for an example, he was excused from his contract at 18. He enlisted in the war, like we saw over 10,000 home children who enlisted in the First World War alone. By the time he turned 21, he was dead. He was killed on the first day of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. So where did his money go? Who got that? They're also paying $3 per head to apply. The farmers had to pay $3 a head to apply for a child, and we're going to get into that a bit more. And here we are. In 1909, for an example, there were 2,424 children that were immigrated. And we see down in the bottom here that we've got that from House of Commons report. And there were 15,417 applications received at a charge of $3 per application. Now, they were also being paid bonuses by the government. So the government of Canada would give them $2 a head to bring the children into Canada. And the UK government was paying them the equivalent of $2 a head Canadian to get them out of the country as well, too. In 1897, there was another, the law was put into place that we should have a better quality of child as well, too. In 1897, the Ontario law came into place that all the sending organizations had to have homes here in Canada in order to receive the child. So some of them had them before and some of them had them after. There was only really one organization that I really know of. William Patty was his name, and he didn't have a receiving home here in Canada. And he was bringing his children in and just handing them out at the train stations. Maria Rye was another one that liked to do that, even though she did have a receiving home in Niagara-on-the-Lake. She was known to line her children up, as they got off the trains, and the community members and farmers would just come in and start selecting children and just take them straight from the street. And as we said, that Canada didn't want the children that were truly in need. So after the 1890s, most of these families came from families in need, or most of these children came from families in need. As we also, we had commented before, that we have the welfare systems and, mother's allowance. So effectively, whatever would bring you to the welfare office in today's society, those are the families then that they began to target for immigration. We have the lady on the right of my screen here, which is Annie Cheeseman, and she's actually my mother's mother. And she lost 6 of her children in 1924 for the sin of being a single parent. Her husband deserted her, and she was unable to look after her 6 children financially. She loved them. She wanted them. But she had no choice. She actually put the children into the workhouse, which was worse than putting them into like Bernardo's or something like that. And my mom was just a newborn. She was just days old when they admitted her to the workhouse. They really didn't survive the harsh workhouse conditions. And I did travel to England a couple of years ago, and I visited the site of the workhouse where my mother was, and and they still had the cemetery in the back there full of the burials of people who didn't survive. They weren't marked or anything like that, but you knew where they were. And that just broke my heart, because that was my family. That could have been my mother. And it's really something. And, all my grandmother needed was some help to keep her family together. That's all she needed. And should that have happened? Yes. As we're getting Ancestry and we have the social media, we're now connecting more and more with the families left behind in the UK. And these pictures are starting to surface that show the intact families where these children came from. And like I said, they fell upon hard times, desertion, death, illness, any one of those things. And, and for that, their children, you deserve to lose your children, and they deserve to be sent to a different country and put to work on our farms. Since the 1990s, mid-1990s, the organizations in the UK have opened up the record books, and they're now sending out the records of the children. Mind you, you have to pay. And there's a huge long waiting list to get them. These are my aunts, Aunt Mary and my Aunt Sarah. And this is just an example of what we receive from Bernardo. So not only do you have information on why they were taken into care, you get information on any family that is known about. You get information on what they happened while they were under care in Bernardo's in the UK. And then they kept track of these children, what happened to them here in Canada as well, too. And so, we got incredible records, and it was a very, very terrible story, about Aunt Mary and Aunt Sarah. Mary was, these kids were horribly neglected. Their father was still alive. He, had a stepmother. And let's just put it this way. When they were rescued by Bernardo's, these 2 children spent weeks recovering in hospital. They said that they were the size of little human skeletons, and they were just so horribly neglected and beaten, and and just not looked after very well. And then they put them into the hospital, and then once they got out of hospital, they were then put into Bernardo's. And Bernardo's had a girls' village over just outside of London called Barkingside Girls' Village, and in that village, these girls thrived, and they were looked after, they were dressed, they were clothed, and they were surrounded by hundreds of children like themselves. And then they sent them to Canada. They were already saved in Barkingside. They didn't need to go to Canada to save them. Aunt Mary was moved over 20 times here in Canada. She was whipped, beaten, she was raped. She gave birth to a stillborn baby at the age of 14. She had a horrific life here in Canada, and that continued until she met a Bernardo boy who married her and whisked her away to Winnipeg, and she ended up thriving with him. She ended up having a really good life with him. So there is a good ending to her story. But when you consider the trauma in her childhood and then the trauma that she faced here in Canada, she's a very strong woman. I mean, she became a very loving parent and had a very, very, very good life here in Canada. But a lot of children that suffered this were not as lucky. I mean, we have all kinds of children acting out, burning barns, there was murders, there was suicides, there was all kinds of stuff. I mean, when you have children, that are in so much pain and they, it's really sad. It chokes me up thinking about it anyway. And like I said, there was the good and the bad. We had already heard about Aunt Mary and what she had gone through. And we have Cecil Bennett here. And Cecil Bennett, we had gone through his contract. And, I've never been able to figure out his information over in the UK, what family he came from. I know he had brothers. And I'm hoping as more and more records become, released and stuff, that we might be able to find out a little bit more. It would be nice to reconnect him with his family again. But he was taken into the home of Ben Johnson, and with Ben Johnson, he was very, very well looked after, and he was loved just like a son. So he ended up in a very good situation here in Canada. And in fact, after he died in the First World War, he was mourned very deeply by the family, and the family kept all of his things. And they did turn them over to me a number of years ago, but they had everything, like his Bible, his good conduct medal, things that he got here in Canada, his trunk that he brought from the UK to Canada, as we were talking about the trunks, and all of his contract information, which was absolutely amazing to have. I mean, I don't think that we have another complete record of information as we receive from, the Johnson family. It's interesting to also note that Canada did not stop the immigration of children until 1970. Now, they didn't come to Canada until 1970, although we have uncovered, the odd child coming up to, the 1950s. In mid-1950s is about probably the latest one that I can find. So they obviously stopped immigrating parties of children, but maybe the odd child and stuff like that came out under their guidance. But they did send the children to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And like I said, it didn't stop until 1970. So these archaic laws that they put into place in the 1890s and stuff. I mean, although they would have been refined a bit over the years, I mean, they still stuck and they still did this. Over 4 million descendants in Canada. And yet, the most resounding thing we heard from the home children was their silence. And because of their silence, most Canadians don't know their story. And the silence, came from the stigmatization that they were, that they all were placed under. I mean, they were all tarred with that same brush when they got off the ships and landed in Nova Scotia or wherever they landed. And, nobody ever said, well, Johnny over there looks like a nice guy, so we're going to cut him some slack. I mean, they were all treated the same way. I have one home child that just recently passed away. Cyril Hewitt was his name. And he just said that, whenever company came over, he was told to get out. He said, we were told we were a nobody. You're just a gutter rat. And, and he came over in 1938. So even in 1938, all that stigmatization that they put on these children in Victorian England, and even the sending organizations, Maria Rye was famous for, talking about these children in derogatory, fashions and, and saying these terrible things about the kids. And it just, it's astounding that it lasted all these years. But in spite of all that, many home children went on to make good lives and to make great contributions to Canada. And, and that's one of the things that, that we really strive to share, to acknowledge, and to be proud of our home children. I mean, most of them survived, and most of them went on and created families for themselves here in Canada. Most of them created good jobs, had good lives. This is Cyril Hewitt, who we've just mentioned, and this is Sir George Beardshaw. And so George is our last surviving original home child, and that is the children that came up until 1939. Out of over 100,000 children, George is the last one that's surviving. And he's also our last surviving home child that served in our wars. He was a veteran of the Queen's Own Rifles. And that's another thing that we need to acknowledge too. And it's another thing, that the service in our wars is very close to my heart. And and we work very hard at having that acknowledged. We now have had the Veterans Affairs Canada acknowledge the service of the home children as an individual group of Canadians who served. So if you go to their website, you're going to see the home children and you're going to see information about their service in our wars, which is fantastic. George, he turned 99 just a couple of weeks ago, and for his 99th birthday, we had nominated him for the French Medal of Honor, and it's called the Legion of Honor, and it's the equivalent to the Order of Canada, but it's awarded to by the French government, and it's for his participation in the liberation of France. And they at first weren't giving it out to Canadians, but they, over the years have decided that they're going to award it to Canadian soldiers who participated. And, so we did send in George's application and he was approved. So in a surprise military event in London just a couple of weeks ago, we had all the military officials and stuff there, and they presented him with this medal. And I didn't realize until that day that he also has been knighted by the French government. So he is now Sir George Beardshaw. And I think that was an amazing gift for his 99th birthday. I can't wait to see what we're going to pull off for 100. We've had tons and tons of books that have been written about the home children over the years. And we do have a page on Facebook where I put in all the books that I can find about home children. So you can browse the books. And these are some of the better ones. We've got, if you're wanting to learn really about the home children, the first book that I point everyone to is The Little Immigrants, The Orphans Who Came to Canada by Kenneth Bagnall. And that was published in the 1980s, and it hit the bestsellers list on Canada, in Canada. And it's just an incredible book. It is, it's lasted the time. And Kenneth just died last year. I think it was the beginning of this year. Time just kind of blends, doesn't it? But I was able to attend his funeral and speak to his family down there. And they're just thrilled that, of the impact that this book has made in Canada and continues to do. We also have another book that was written it was actually published in 2020, just as COVID was outbreaking. Since The Little Immigrants was published, we've never had a Canadian bestseller book about the home children. But this book called The Forgotten Home Child was published, like I said, and it was the #1 Canadian bestseller for 4 months. And I served as the historical consultant to this book. And I'm really proud of Genevieve Graham. I mean, she's a well-known Canadian author and she does historical fictions, but, it's her attention to detail and the way that she presented the story. And it really is a book that I really recommend that you should read. Connections to Orillia, and there are many. As I said, my mother was a child immigrant, and she came in 1924 through the Salvation Army. She was born in 1922 and placed into the workhouse just shortly after birth. The family here that you see with her, those are her adoptive parents, and that's Jen and George Elder. And they lived in Fair Valley, and that's the picture of the home that they had in Fair Valley. And that's my mom shortly after she arrived in Canada. And that's one of the very first pictures that, that we have of Mom. And that's my mom, at the age of 16. And what a beautiful woman she was. And, she ended up with a good home. But, nobody told her that she had been adopted. And she didn't find out until she was about 18 years of age. And it was very traumatic. She said to me one time, I mean, she didn't say anything to us at all until she was 86. I had no clue what was going on with my family until she was about 86. And then she said to us one time, she says, I was born in England, and I'm going, no, why would I know that? I mean, you told me you were born in Fair Valley. And then she said, well, I was adopted. Now, again, it's not your typical home child story because home children were not adopted, but my mother was. And she ended up, with this family, and my grandmother went in and legally took custody of my mom because she didn't want anyone taking her away from them. And legal adoption did not come into play until 1922 in Ontario. So even though you look back on the records and it says adopted, daughter of or son of or something like that, when you're looking back, they weren't legally adopted. I mean, they just did take a child into your home and, they would just call that adoption, but it wasn't legal adoption. And like I said, Mom was one of the first legal adoptions done in Ontario. When I get into her background, her father was also a home child. Now, it's very rare, again, to have a father and a daughter who are both home children. And that happened because he came in 1894 with the Dr. Bernardo homes. And he was placed out in Manitoba, made his way into Saskatchewan, picked up land from the Dominion's Land Act. So he was a homesteader, which a lot of home children did that as well, too. In 1912, he ordered a mail order bride. So my grandmother came into Rosetown, Saskatchewan, and she married him the day she arrived. And 9 months later, they had their first baby. But they had 5 children over in Saskatchewan, and then there was trouble on the farm, and he ended up taking them back to the UK. And long story short, because it gets into a big long story of exactly what happened, he left the UK. He was to come back to Canada and sell up the farm and rejoin his family in the UK, and he never came back. She liked to tell family that he sold the farm in Rosetown and that he was on horseback going into Moose Jaw with his money, and he was murdered, and his body was left to rot with all the cow bones or whatever it was out there, buffalo bones and stuff like that. But that's a story that she told family, but it was really untrue. He was very much alive, and she didn't know where he was, but he was very much alive. There's a lot of home children that were placed in Orillia, and we have some of the names up here. We have some of the families that I know that are still living in Orillia, descendants that are still living in Orillia. Frederick Holt and Sadie Eaton was another one. She was actually placed with Katie Mae Sanderson with my grandparents. So my mom's adoptive grandparents also had a home child that my mom knew as Aunt Katie. And I never knew Aunt Katie was a home child. She was just like one of the family. So, really hats off to the Elder family. I just think that they're just amazing people. I really do. And I just think that, that a shout out has to be made to a lot of the Canadian families that did take these children. And they did treat them, as one of the family. And we have a number of home children that are buried in Orillia. Now, we also have to keep in mind that we have been making a burial index of where all the home children are buried, and we have just over 7,000 names, but we have 100,000 that we need to find. So as we keep finding more and more information and we keep building the indexes, we're going to find even more and more children that were connected to the different areas and stuff. So it's very interesting and a very worthwhile project that we're working on with that. And these are just some of the pictures of all the home children in my family. We've got quite a few. The 3 children down in the lower left corner are my mom's brother and her 2 twin sisters. And these children were actually born in, and little Archie above them with a little cute face. These family this family was actually born, these kids were actually born in Canada. So it makes them Canadian-born home children. So, and that's another thing, because when we talk about British home children, everybody thinks that they're just children that were born in the UK, and that's not true. They could be born in in the United States. I have home children that were born in the United States. I have them that were born in Africa, and I have now discovered a home child that was born in China. So it doesn't matter where they were born. If they ran into trouble in the UK, then they could become British home children. Katie Mae Sanderson, of course, we heard about Katie. She, definitely, she did grow up in Fair Valley, but she trained at the hospital in Orillia. You can just see the little picture of her nursing there. And she made her life in Orillia, and she made a very valuable contributions to the city of Orillia over the years. And she was a wonderful, wonderful lady. Cecilia Joette is one of my darlings of Orillia. She trained for a nurse again at the Orillia Hospital. She was befriended by Stephen Leacock, and she did gardening for him. And Leacock encouraged her to write her memoirs about being a home child. And she did that in her book, No Thought for Tomorrow, The Story of a Northern Nurse. And it's interesting because I actually read that book. My mom had a copy of it in her basement, and I read it when I was about 14 years of age. And that story stuck with me. It really stuck with me. And, when I found out about my family's connection to like the Bernardos and all the rest of it, I knew the story of the children. I didn't know all of it, and I had my preconceived ideas about it. And it, like I thought they were all orphans and, things that we were, really taught to believe. And when I found out about my mom's story and how she wasn't really an orphan, and the situation, under the circumstances in which, her mother lost these children, it resonated with me because I became a single parent, and I had to, I had no job to support myself. I had to go to the food bank. I had to go to welfare, I had, but the thing is that those systems were in place to help us, and to me, it was like telling me that, that I wasn't good enough to raise my kids because I was a single parent. And, it, like I said, it resonated with me because I found out about my grandmother and her situation. So I wanted to know how many other children were like this. I wanted to know how many were like my mom. And that's what started me. And I found lots and lots and lots that, were taken for those reasons. And, I like to think I vindicated my grandmother a little bit in all of this too, my biological grandmother. I feel desperately sorry for her. And she did also come to Canada. She did marry here in Canada out west. And she did raise like a second family. And I have been in contact with them. I have found everybody. And I've been out west to visit them. And of course, they could tell me, things that they knew about her side of the story. And, it was really interesting to reconnect with the family and to find out. And I think that's, another reason why we work so hard with our families is because everyone deserves to know the truth. And so did the home children. We have Albert and Reg Jeffkins, they were also placed in Orillia. And this is kind of a neat little picture here because that's actually taken on the farm. I think it was just outside of Orillia where they were placed. So we had a lot of home children that were placed up in the area. Orillia is home to many descendants, such as Sylvia Smith. Sylvia's paternal grandmother and aunt, Bertha and Annie, were taken into care by the inspector of the Dr. Bernardo homes after the 5 children of Rebecca Rudding were found to have been in a deplorable state of grimy filth. You have to kind of read in between the lines as well, too. Rebecca had been left on her own to support 5 children. And again, in the situation with my grandmother, how many people could have done that? And behind me, you can see that I have a quilt here. The quilt was created in 2016. And every square represents a home child. Most of the squares were designed by myself and sewn by Joanne Clark of Orillia. Now, Joanne definitely gave a lot of input into the design of, the squares and stuff. I would send the prototype off to her, and she would critique it and let me know how I should tweak it and stuff. And she was given the daunting task, however, of sewing this quilt out of flag material. And I can't think that there'd be another quilt like it. And the reason I had it done in flag material is because I can fold this flag up, or this quilt up. This thing is like bulletproof. And the one thing that I really like about the quilt is usually when you have quilts, people are told not to touch it. Well, they can touch this quilt. And, I don't want donuts and coffee on the quilt, but, clean hands, but they can touch this quilt. And, it adds texture and it adds feeling. And, and I think it's a closer connection for people. So you can get in contact with us if you want any more information, or if you have questions, if you want help with research. You can visit us at www.homechildrencanada.ca. You can join our Facebook group. And I'm sorry, I should have changed this because we've been known for 10 years under the name British Home Children Advocacy and Research Association. But we have incorporated, and we're now a Canadian charity as of March of this year. And our name has changed, and we're now known as Home Children Canada. So the Facebook group, we have a Facebook page for Home Children Canada, but we've recently changed the name of our research group on Facebook to simply Home Children Canada Research Group.
We already have questions in the chat here for you.
Sure.
The first one is coming in from Queensland, Australia. So good morning.
Good morning.
Their great-grandmother and her siblings were British home children who arrived in Canada in 1880. So the story goes, they were aged 2 to 10. Their mother had died and their father handed them into the Liverpool sheltering home. They were sent to Canada in pairs. So would their father have had to give permission for them to come to Canada? It was before the 1891 Act.
Not necessarily. No, that was through Louisa Burt, and those children would have been taken into Knowlton, Quebec in those years, but no, not necessarily.
Okay.
We don't have we have a lot of information about some of the sending organizations, but other ones we don't necessarily. So Louisa Burt, a lot of her records, by the way, are held by the Bernardo offices in England. So if they haven't contacted Bernardo's to get those records, then they can do that. They won't be the $250 ones because there wouldn't be a lot of information contained in those records in comparison to the Bernardo records. So I don't think we have really any contracts that really show whether they had to sign that Canada clause or not. So I don't know, actually. That's a good question.
Very cool. Vicky is wondering, did some home children come from Scotland?
Yes, definitely. Yes, definitely. The Quarriers Orphan Homes of Scotland sent over 5,000 children here to Canada. Annie McPherson in the earlier years was immigrating children from Scotland. Dr. Bernardo's took children from Scotland. Emma Sterling also sent children out of Scotland. So yeah, definitely there was a large amount of children that were sent from Scotland here to Canada.
And Vicky also says, thank you very much for all your work on behalf of home children. I can clearly see it's a labor of love.
Thank you.
Okay, so Heather says, my husband's great aunt went to Hazelbrae at 12. Her father had died, leaving mom with 4 little children. The family has photos of her with her brothers who came to Canada later on their own. I wonder if she became under contract and worked for a family. She did marry but had no children. I checked for her guardian papers and there was no parent information there. I wish I could find out more about her. Any suggestions?
Yeah, if you send me an email, I can definitely help you out there. Hazelbrae, we've actually just released an index of the children that were sent to Hazelbrae. You can find a link to that on our website. She definitely would have been contracted and put out to work. That was the set standard for Bernardo children. There's also would be records available for her in the United Kingdom as well too that may answer a lot of the questions that you have regarding her. Bernardo's also published a magazine called the Ups and Downs magazine. And in that magazine, they publish stories of thousands, literally thousands of these children. And so sometimes there are mentions and there's more information in those magazines as well, too. So, we've got all kinds of links on the website where you can go to, where you can start looking for this information, as well as Library and Archives Canada have released thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of documents pertaining to the home children over the years. So we did break down those documents, and we have published an index to the file. Sometimes it's a lot of page turning, and sometimes you don't come up with anything, and sometimes you come up with a lot. So there are a lot of resources that are available if you know where to look. And that's why, researching the home children is such a specialized thing, that most people, they don't know how to research them, and they don't know where to find the families. So that's what we specialize in, is to make sure that you're pointed in the right directions. You're also welcome to join our Facebook group. And like I said, just, if you're comfortable in public, if you're not, then we're more than happy to work, privately through email or anything like that. But again, you put the information in and you would just be gobsmacked really with what the group can find for you. But we've also published, there is a link on our homepage that says how to research your home children. And in that link, I've linked you to all kinds of places where you need to go to find this information. So there's all kinds of avenues, there's all kinds of ways, and we would be more than pleased to help you.
The final question, do Bernardo homes still exist? And if yes, what is their role in today's world?
They're like a social services for children. So yes, they still exist today. So do Poiriers, so do Fagan, so did the Middlemore homes. A lot of the sending organizations still exist today. Emma Sterling, who brought children out of Edinburgh, her organization still exists today, and it's actually the Children's Aid Society it's called Children's First in Scotland. So it's very active today. She was on the forefront of the anti-cruelty movement that swept through, Scotland and England back in the mid 1870s. So definitely, it still exists today. And these organizations, they've apologized for what they have done in the past. I mean, they're not responsible for this, mass immigration of children, and they work very closely with our organization as well too. So we get along really good with them. The charges that they have for the records, what am I going to say about that? Nothing.
So to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, I do apologize, but we're running low on time. But Lori's put up the link to their Facebook page. So it sounds like if you do have further questions or are curious about research avenues, that is the place to go.